Welcome to Stuff You Missed in History Class, a production of iHeartRadio. Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Holly Fry.
And I'm Tracy V. Wilson.
Tracy, I know I have told this story on the show before. I think it was on a behind the scenes. That when I was a kid, I used to write pamphlets about science and nature and leave them around the house because I thought my family needed to be educated. Those are all sourced from our 1976 editions of the World Book Encyclopedia. Listen, we could talk about what a conceited little child I was, but that's a different story. But I will tell you that butterflies got a lot of coverage in those missives. It was actually one of the few topics that got multiple pamphlets written about them. It was pretty much like butterflies, foxes, and astronomy were the big repeat items, but most of the time it was just a little. And when I say pamphlets, I mean like a little 2 pages stapled and folded together and everything written in pencil. Like, I really thought my family was going to study this ridiculous business written by, like, a snooty 7-year-old. But in any case, monarchs were a very big favorite, like they are for many, many kids. We talked about that a little bit on the behind the scenes as well. We are still, though, sitting sort of smack dab in the middle of the history of monarchs as we know it. And the next chapter of that history is really going to be up to humans. So I thought we would talk today about what we know about these very beautiful and flashy insects, which are also common enough that most of us have familiarity with them if we grew up in North America. Talk about how we came to know what we do know about them and what we're still trying to figure out, as well as what parts of the story have kind of been misrepresented over the years.
So the monarch butterfly is probably the most widely recognized butterfly in the world. I would say definitely in the U.S. Just hearing the common name, most people can immediately picture it. And just in case you can't, this species has bright orange wings with black veins and black borders. This butterfly's scientific name is Danaus plexippus. It's a milkweed butterfly, meaning that it's in the subfamily Daninae within the family Nymphalidae.
We'll talk a little bit about that nomenclature in a little bit, but we mentioned milkweed there, and that's the primary diet of monarch butterflies, which is unique because milkweed is toxic to just about everything else, including humans. And that's kind of how monarchs have survived so well for so long. They really don't have competition for food source. But it also has made them very welcome visitors for people who keep livestock, for example, because milkweed is poisonous to other animals. A healthy monarch population that can keep the plant's growth in check reduces dangers to grazing herds. When we say poisonous, it's probably not going to kill any other animal, but it will make them very ill. Adult monarchs will also feed on other flowering plants as well as milkweed.
Monarchs lay their eggs on the milkweed, and then those eggs hatch, and the caterpillars are sitting right on their food. They eat their little egg first, and then they only eat the milkweed. They retain that plant's toxin in their bodies. This makes the caterpillars toxic to predators, although through the glycosides that they ingest, and this toxicity stays with the monarch through the pupa stage and into adulthood. So this probably won't kill a bird, but will make it sick if the bird eats a monarch, so most birds learn pretty quickly not to mess with them.
And we mentioned the egg and caterpillar stages of the monarch's life cycle, but here's a little bit more detail. While the courtship between male and female butterflies of this species happens largely in the air, the actual mating and fertilization happens in what's often called ground phase. And then the females head to their breeding ground, which sometimes requires migration, something we're going to talk about a lot more throughout this episode. And then they lay their eggs, as we said, on milkweed plants. A single female can lay as many as 300 to 500 eggs over the course of several weeks. And when the caterpillars hatch, as Tracy said, they start to munch. And the caterpillars of monarchs are black, yellow, and white striped. They're even pretty interesting looking in that stage.
Mm-hmm. It takes about 2 weeks for monarchs to go through their egg and larva stages. Once they've reached full size as a caterpillar, loaded up with all those glycosides from their food source, they enter the pupa stage. Pupation is when the monarch caterpillar forms a case around its body known as a chrysalis. Normally, this hangs from the underside of the milkweed leaf. Inside the chrysalis, over a period of 9 to 15 days, metamorphosis takes place. The insect's wings grow in and its body changes shape. Once it emerges from the chrysalis, it changes even more as the wings attain their full stretch and the body elongates.
Yeah, I have also seen some research that said that the milkweed is not really where they're gonna do their pupa stage. I have read sources that say both, so just FYI if that rang oddly to you. The lifespan of monarchs varies, and that is actually connected to their migration cycle. Most generations of monarchs live for a few weeks. You'll sometimes list it as a month. You'll sometimes see it as 6 weeks. But the generation that hatches late in the summer is destined for the fall migration south for winter. And there's a cool mechanism in place to enable them to live long enough to make that trip, which is that they have a delay in their sexual maturation. While normally a monarch butterfly's life would be all about finding a mate once it matures and then laying eggs, completing its life mission, the pre-autumn group doesn't normally mate until after they have overwintered and the reproduction cycle begins in March, so they can live as long as 8 months.
Monarch butterflies are generally considered to be native to North and South America, although the population in South America is now quite small. They can be found in small numbers in several other places. Hawaii, Spain, and Australia all have their own monarch populations, but North America is really their primary location.
Yeah, you will also see a lot of different information about how they got to places like Hawaii, Spain, and Australia, whether those were brought there by people or whether they migrated there themselves or whether they got there through some other means of naturally being there for maybe much longer than we know. What we do know is that they don't migrate in any of those other places, only in North America. So there are 2 recognized populations of monarch butterflies in North America. The Western breeding group consists of the butterflies that are west of the Rocky Mountains. And the Eastern group lives and breeds primarily in Canada and the Great Plains, as well as areas farther to the east. And perhaps the most unique characteristic of monarch butterflies is the fact that they do migrate. The western monarchs typically overwinter in Southern California, and the eastern group migrates to central Mexico for winter.
It takes generations to make the full cycle of their journey. The migration southward typically happens in 1 generation, and then the northward migration happens in 2 to 4, depending on how far north they travel. After each generation lays eggs, they die, and the resulting offspring continue on with the trek. This, of course, follows a route that shifts with temperatures. What's really odd and marvelous is that the generation that makes it to the southernmost destination point always returns to the same place, a place that generation has never been, and which its parent and grandparent generations had also never been to either, yet they keep returning year after year. Nobody knows exactly why, although there's a great deal of study that's gone into attempting to figure it out, and we will talk about some of that work later on.
Based on fossil record evidence, we know that butterflies have been around for roughly 175 million years. But we don't know exactly when humans became consciously aware of monarch butterflies. The first people to see and recognize them were, of course, indigenous populations of North, Central, and South America, but there's not really a written record of that.
We do know that the oldest specimens that were known to white Europeans were in the collection of James Pettiver. And that comes with some baggage that we should unpack. James Pettiver was born in London in 1663. His father died before he was a teenager, and his maternal grandfather, Richard Elborough, paid for his schooling. In June of 1677, when he was 14, James became an apothecary apprentice under a man named Charles Feldham, who worked for London's St. Bartholomew's Hospital.
While completing his apprenticeship and before becoming an independent apothecary, Pettiver joined the Society of Apothecaries, and it was through outings with this group that he began his first herbarium collection that is now in London's Natural History Museum. James finished his apprenticeship in 1685 and opened an apothecary business of his own at the sign of the White Cross, Aldersgate Street, and that's where he worked for the rest of his life.
And during that life, he became incredibly well known. He was active in the science community and developed and maintained relationships with members of the Royal Society as he offered his expertise on various matters. And his herbarium collection, which grew to include thousands of samples, was really renowned. While Pettiver collected many samples himself, he gained a lot of specimens thanks to his relationships with explorers and sailors who he asked to pick up unique items as they traveled around the world. That's how he came into possession of a monarch butterfly, which was preserved for him between two sheets of mica paper. This is noted as having been collected between 1698 and 1709 in Maryland.
Now, we're mentioning all of this because it connects our knowledge of monarchs in history, as well as other information about the natural world, to the slave trade. In a paper by Kathleen S. Murphy published in the William and Mary Quarterly in October 2013, the author tracked the people that provided Pettiver specimens from the Atlantic Basin, and almost half of them were on ships that traveled slave trade routes, including the ones that went to Maryland, which is where that butterfly was found. And we're talking about all of this because this is illustrative of how deeply intertwined so many parts of European and North American history are with the slave trade, even the parts that don't, on their surface, have any obvious connection. In that paper, Murphy makes the point that all of the people that Pettiver worked with were ship surgeons or captains, so they were men of rank who were actively engaged in slavery. No one in this transaction could really claim ignorance. So while the collections and publications of Pettiver helped advance Europe's knowledge of the natural world and of monarch butterflies, that knowledge came at a price that's really not acknowledged most of the time.
We'll talk about mentions of monarch butterflies that came after Pettiver after we pause for a sponsor break.
After Pettiver's specimen, the next significant example we have of a monarch butterfly in the historical record is the illustration work of Mark Catesby. Catesby was born in 1683 in Essex, England, and unlike Pettiver, Catesby made the trip to North America to collect specimens himself, more than once. When his father died in 1712, Catesby traveled to live with his sister and her husband in Virginia, and there he began collecting seeds and specimens for collectors back home in England, as well as drawing many of them or painting them so the specimens would have accompanying illustrations. He stayed in the colonies for 7 years, traveling through the Appalachian Mountains and around the Southeast, and he even went to Jamaica before returning to London in 1719. And when he got back to England, his work was very well received by the scientific community. At this point in time, just for context, Sir Isaac Newton was chair of the Royal Society. And under the auspices of the Society, botanist William Sherard led a fundraising effort to send Catesby back to the colonies so he could do more of this work.
The Royal Society was able to drum up enough sponsors that it could pay for Mark Catesby's second transatlantic voyage to North America to do a more comprehensive survey of the continent's flora and fauna. He sailed in February of 1722, and after 3 months at sea, made it to the destination of South Carolina. Over the course of 4 years, Catesby fulfilled his mission to document as much of the North American Southeast's natural world as possible. He focused on the Atlantic coastal lowcountry of South Carolina and Florida, as well as the Bahamas.
After Catesby once again returned to England, he started compiling his field notes, specimens, and illustrations into a 2-volume work titled Natural History of Carolina, Florida, and the Bahama Islands. This project took a lot of time. The first volume published in 1729, the second not until 1747, so it's 18 years later. And it is in that second volume of the work, which is dedicated to Augusta, Princess of Wales, that Catesby's illustration of the monarch butterfly appears. It's quite beautiful. It is plate 88 in the book, and it features the butterfly along with a dollar orchid and a clamshell orchid, both of which are growing from the trunk of a tree.
By this point, people were already calling the butterfly a monarch. It's believed that the name was given to the insect by early English colonists in North America as a nod to William III of England, also known as William of Orange, having been born the Prince of Orange. But it wasn't yet classified scientifically. That didn't happen until 1758 when Carl Linnaeus included it in his 10th edition of Systema Naturae.
Linnaeus, who was born in 1707 in Småland, Sweden, is of course famous for his classification of binomial nomenclature. And due to starting out without the benefit of a wealthy family to support his studies, Linnaeus, who could easily be a future podcast subject because I don't think he's shown up on the show before, surprisingly.
Yeah, we've mentioned him, but like not in a bunch of
Not
detail.
a focus, no. He had to take kind of a slow route in his pursuit of a career and becoming a published scientific writer. His deepest interest was botany. It was something he had loved since he was young, but he became a medical doctor to support himself. And it was only after that, after he became a doctor, that he started to get the backing to start publishing his System of Nature. That started out with a first volume that was a folio, just 11 pages long.
Linnaeus was aided by information like Catesby's illustrations, and he placed the monarch in his taxonomy, giving it the genus Papilio and the species Plexippus. Linnaeus initially put all butterflies in the genus Papilio, but that changed over time. Linnaeus had included subgenuses, of which Danaus was one, and that system was then refined by other taxonomists after Linnaeus died. Today, the Papilio genus mostly contains swallowtail butterflies, whereas Danaus is its own genus, composed of what's sometimes called the tiger butterfly tribe or the tiger butterfly group. You'll also see the North American monarch specifically referred to as the subspecies Danaus plexippus plexippus.
Yeah, that's just since there are some that are basically biologically identical, but they appear in other places. Linnaeus noted in his writing that he had chosen the names using the sons of the Greek mythological figure Aegyptus. Though in Greek legend, Danaus is the brother of Aegyptus. Plexippus was one of Aegyptus's 50 sons, though. In that legend, just to give you context, Danaus had 50 daughters, and Aegyptus forced Danaus to marry his daughters to Aegyptus's 50 sons. So convenient they had the same number, and all of the daughters at their father's instruction killed their new husbands on their wedding night. That's, of course, only one part of the mythology of these people. But Carl Linnaeus may have been a bit confused on the exact nature of the story, and in any case, the nomenclature that he chose for butterflies doesn't seem to reflect any observations about their behaviors or life cycle.
Observing that life cycle is something that has interested naturalists for centuries now. In 1881, the overwintering sites of the monarch along the California coast were identified, but there was still the eastern group. Nobody was quite sure where they were going in the winter. At least, nobody who didn't live where they were going. For a long time, the Gulf Coast of Florida was believed to be one possibility, and naturalists hunted for that spot where the butterflies might be riding out the winter. Soon it became apparent that although that area is warmer than other parts of the U.S. in the winter, it still can experience frosts, and butterflies can't survive that kind of temperature drop, so that was finally ruled out.
And this is where Fred and Nora Urquhart come into the story. Fred Urquhart had been fascinated by monarch butterflies since his Toronto, Ontario childhood. And that fascination had never abated. It actually led him to study biology at the University of Toronto starting in the 1930s. And then he went on to earn his master's degree and his PhD in the same field. When he finished his education, he became the insect collection curator for the Royal Ontario Museum. During his education, he met Nora Roden, who was also enrolled in the school, although she was studying social work. During World War II, Fred worked in meteorological service, and when that conflict ended, he took a job at the University of Toronto, and he and Nora were married in 1945.
Theirs was a true partnership. Nora became as passionate about butterflies as Fred was. And one question really was plaguing them, which was where did these insects go in the winter? Together, they sought out the answer.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because they're now pretty well known for having done this. But in one interview, Fred mentioned that people were like, "Why are you doing this? There's no money in this." And he's like, it's making me crazy not to know.
I want to.
I really want to know. And one of the first things that the Urquharts did was to try to find a way to tag butterflies. This was challenging, as you might expect. They not only had to come up with something that would stay in place, but it also couldn't hurt the butterfly or impede the insect's ability to fly. They tried various paint options and labels, which did not work. And then they came up with a system that finally passed the test. That test, incidentally, involved gently tying the butterflies to the handlebars of Fred's bike with a fine thread. And then he would ride and make sure that they could fly along with him. But that solution was price tag stickers that were intended for glassware because they were light enough that they didn't make a big difference.
Fred and Nora developed a careful system in which they scraped some of the scales off of one of the insect's wings, and then they would fold the sticker around the edge of the wing. The butterflies kept flying as normal, seemingly unbothered. Every tiny sticker had contact information for the Urquhart's office so that anybody who found one of these butterflies or even just saw them might be able to report in to the couple.
But this also meant that there needed to be a way to let particularly amateur lepidopterists know to even be looking for butterflies with stickers on them. So the next step was a print campaign. Nora had the idea to place ads in newspapers and magazines around the United States to explain the project and ask citizen science to help out. You'll sometimes see this as referenced as the first big citizen science project. And they got volunteers through the organization that they established, which was the Insect Migration Association, to help them tag all of the thousands of Toronto area butterflies.
We'll talk about the response to those ads after we pause and hear from some of the sponsors that keep Stuff You Missed in History class going.
It wasn't long after Nora's ad placements that data and information started flowing in. Every time someone contacted the Urquharts to report a sighting of a butterfly, Fred and Nora noted it on a big map. One theory at the start of the project was that eastern monarchs might be joining the western group along the California coast. But the information that Fred and Nora collected quickly made it apparent that wasn't happening. For one thing, there simply were not enough monarchs in California to make up for the migrating numbers leaving southern Canada and the U.S.
The next step was to travel to the southern U.S. themselves to see what they might be able to find out. So they drove 20,000 miles as they traveled all around Texas, just chasing leads and coming up short. Their information stopped at the Mexican border because their ad placements had only been in U.S. papers. So they did the next logical thing, which was to put announcements in papers south of the border.
And one of their primary responses came from an American man named Kenneth Brugger, who wrote, quote, "I read with interest your article on the Monarch. It occurred to me that I might be of some help." Kenneth was an engineer from Wisconsin working at a textile firm in Mexico City, and he had seen groups of monarchs in the area. Before long, Brugger and a woman who he identified as Kathy Aguado, we'll talk about him identifying her as that in a bit, started tracking the insects in their Winnebago. Brugger and Aguado married in May 1974 after they had started helping the Urquharts, and the two couples met when Kenneth and Kathy, whose real name is Catalina, she apparently did not actually like the name Kathy, which is what her husband called her, when they visited Toronto.
After the Bruggers returned to Mexico, there was a system. The Urquharts would send them tips that they got from people who had spotted the tagged butterflies, and Kenneth and Catalina would follow up on those sightings and then report back. They were essentially being the boots on the ground for the Canadian couple. Often, Ken would drive and Catalina would scan the landscape with binoculars looking for butterflies. At this point, Ken had retired and they were free to pretty much spend their time as they wished.
Yeah, they had gone from doing this only on the weekends to this being basically their full-time lives. They did a lot of it. We're telling a very fast version, but it took them a long time. Throughout Christmas 1974 and into New Year's Day of 1975, the Bruggers had been following monarchs near the mountains in Michoacan. That's about 150 miles from where Catalina had grown up. On January 2nd, 1975, they hiked up the mountain known as Cerro Pelon, which is an old volcano. And in that afternoon, after a long day of hiking in fairly miserable conditions, Catalina looked up, and she yelled back to Ken that she needed a camera because they had found it, a surreal sanctuary filled with monarchs everywhere they looked.
Catalina later described this moment this way in an interview, quote, "Neither of us could talk. I will never get over seeing so many butterflies at one time. I don't have the words to describe what I saw. My mind just went blank. Then Ken and I walked together. We kept whispering, wow, wow, wow. We didn't want to scare the monarchs in their own sanctuary. The ground was 1.5 feet deep with them. They covered the tree trunks like pages of a book. We stepped carefully so as not to kill any. With each step, I'd shake my foot back and forth until I could feel the bare ground. Then we stood in the middle of a clearing.
And as Catalina became still, the monarchs just started landing right on her. She recounted, quote, "I felt their scratchy feet on my face and thought to myself, oh my God, what are we going to do now? I wish everyone in the world had my eyes right now to see what I'm seeing and feel what I'm feeling because this is so amazing. My God, you butterflies flew thousands of miles and here you are."
After hurrying back down the trail in the dying light, Ken called the Urquharts. In the days that follow, Catalina and Ken found several more colonies. They told nobody besides Fred and Nora for fear that this mountain forest would then be flush with humans who would not be as careful as they were.
And the following year, when it was time for the monarchs to migrate to Mexico, the Urquharts joined Ken and Catalina on Cerro Pelon. They were also accompanied by a National Geographic photographer.
In August of 1976, the Monarch migration news was the cover story for National Geographic. It ran with the title, "Discovered, the Monarch's Mexican Haven." The cover image is Catalina covered in monarchs. Something it mentions Ken Brugger's dog Cola being by his side as he sought out these butterflies. It casually references his wife Kathy, who's referred to as, quote, "a bright and delightful Mexican." It never says that she is the person in the cover image. It also doesn't acknowledge that the local population had known that the monarchs were overwintering there for generations.
Yeah, most of those people were like, yes, my grandfather talked about these all the time. And literally that thing that Tracy just read about Kathy, as she was called in the article, is all that she has mentioned. The write-up is full of quotes from Fred Urquhart, who did undeniably catalyze the entire project. He told the magazine, quote, "Those who have had a dream and have lived to see that dream come true will have some conception of my feelings when I first entered the Mexican forest, and there, before my eyes, was the realization of a dream that had haunted me since I was 16. After that article published, Fred and Nora's life was pretty much all about butterfly study. Fred wrote numerous books and articles about their tracking project and the ongoing study and discoveries regarding monarchs, and Nora kept their organization going and managed their business affairs.
Catalina and Ken divorced in the early 90s, and Catalina had stayed out of the public eye as the Urquharts and Ken Brugger became known as the team that cracked the butterfly migration puzzle. But today, she's the only surviving member of the group. And over the years, she's come to be more widely recognized for the part that she played in this discovery. She consulted on the docudrama about the monarchs called Flight of the Butterflies that came out in 2012. She advocates for the conservation of monarch habitats and continues to be on that keep a low profile. It's clear today that because she was the only Spanish-fluent Mexican-born member of the team, it was Catalina who really enabled the mission to actually meet its goals, particularly the segments of her journey with Ken, where they had to negotiate both terrain and the local populations that he had really no experience with.
In an interview that she gave in 2016, Catalina told a journalist, quote, "I searched for the monarchs because of the love I have for all insects and all of nature, for the awe that they provoke in me in all the beautiful and ugly ways. I care about the truth and the marvelous way that nature works in all of us."
And then here's the big reason that Holly wanted to do this episode. Holly's the one who researched it, in case that was not obvious. Some of our listeners have probably guessed it. The monarch butterfly was classified as endangered on July 21st, 2022. That's about a week before we're recording this episode and a few weeks before it'll come out. According to information reviewed by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, or IUCN, in the last decade, monarch numbers have declined between 23 and 72%. It's a really wide swing, and that's due to variations in measurement, something that's pretty natural when you're trying to track an insect by sight. The Western monarch population has declined by 99% since the 1980s, and their eastern counterparts are doing slightly better, but the numbers are still really grave. Their decline since the 1980s is 80%. So over just 4 decades, they've gone from thriving to endangered.
There are multiple contributors to these dramatic drops. One of the biggest is habitat loss. Logging and construction have wiped out forests that monarchs once visited along their migratory paths. Another is pesticides. Chemical treatments have not only killed butterflies, but also the milkweed plants that they need to survive. Climate change is another threat. During extreme weather events like storms, floods, and drought, butterflies die in large numbers.
The United States has not yet listed the monarch as an endangered species through the Endangered Species Act, but many conservation and environmentalist groups across the country are lobbying for that listing. That listing would be an important step toward guiding recovery efforts because once a species is on the list, critical habitat areas become legally protected. That catalyzes the development of recovery plans as well as carrying them out.
And there is some indication that numbers might be bolstering a little, showing that in some areas, the numbers in the population have gone up ever so slightly. This is just in the last year, but it isn't necessarily a sign that things will continue to get better on their own. But it does offer some hope that with conservation efforts in place, the population may continue to rebound.
Today, we know more than ever about monarchs, but we also still have a lot of questions. There have been projects that have involved genetic sequencing of the species to try to more fully understand their inner compass and their longevity shifts, as well as color differences. There have also been concerns that some studies of monarch DNA have accidentally used misidentified butterflies that are not monarchs.
Yeah, there are a lot of butterfly species that kind of mimic the look of monarchs because that's beneficial to them to look like a toxic animal, and that there may have been some confusion in there. Mexico has taken steps to protect the monarch's overwintering locations. In 1986, the country established the Monarch Butterfly Biosphere Reserve. And at the time of its founding, that reserve consisted of 4 forests totaling about 62 square miles of land. But today, that area has expanded. It's now 217 square miles. And most of this land is communally owned by the communities that live there. And efforts have been made to help transition the residents of those communities from their former occupations in fields like logging, which would have been detrimental to butterflies, to more conservation-minded sources of income, such as beekeeping. There is also a growing ecotourism economy there.
If you live in the U.S. and you want to learn more about how you can help monarch populations, you can visit monarchjointventure.org. It's a partnership of multiple agencies and conservation groups from across the country.
Butterflies.
Yeah.
About which I got very choked up at the end. I have fun listener mail, though, about something that several people have reached out to me about on Twitter from one of our previous episodes, and that is salmon vertebrae.
Oh, yeah.
This particular email is from our listener, Elizabeth, who writes, "Hi, Holly and Tracy. I love your podcast, and my ears perked up at the mention of salmon vertebrae as beads. This is a great idea. With regard to your concern about smell, I have some advice. I am an archaeologist. I won't say where Elizabeth works just to be safe and preserve her privacy. And my specialty is zooarchaeology. On occasion, I have to turn an animal carcass into a skeleton for comparative purposes, so I have some relevant experience. Once you've cleaned the vertebrae in a very low simmer to soften and remove any soft bits, soak the vertebrae in a bath of hydrogen peroxide. Over-the-counter stuff is fine. For a few minutes and then let them dry. Repeat the peroxide bath until they don't smell. Do not use bleach. That will make the vertebrae brittle over time and chalky. For your amusement, I enclose a picture of my cat, Eggs, who is helping me take notes for my weekly D&D game. Best regards, Elizabeth." Okay, Eggs is an orange tabby and adorable. And I want to kiss Eggs. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. This is great information. So for any of you that reached out to me on Twitter about ways that you might also do a salmon bead project, we'll see if I get around to it, but I still think it's pretty great. Then that's how to do it. There have also been people that have sent me that amazing, I didn't take notes on it for this, but there's an artist who has done some really beautiful salmon bead garment projects that are just spectacularly beautiful. So seek those out because they're worth looking at. Thank you again, Elizabeth. Elizabeth. If you would like to write to us, you can do so at historypodcast@iheartradio.com. You can also find us on social media as Missed in History. And if you haven't subscribed to the podcast yet, you can do that on the iHeartRadio app or wherever it is you listen to your favorite shows.
Stuff You Missed in History Class is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.